Tarantino certainly isn't everybody's cup of tea. Despite all the gratuitous references to the darker sides of society, there's no denying he's one of the greats. His dialogue is sharp and engaging, his depiction of violence is graphic but stylized, and his use of music is devastatingly effective. This guy has a monopoly on cool cinema. Part of the guy's brilliance is the detailed thought he puts into creating his own world. He's invented his own brand of cigarettes and dropped in references to the fictional Big Kahuna burger wherever fitting. But this world building isn't limited to product placement. Whether he includes the details or not, his characters all have rich and sordid pasts, adding that extra depth to his movies. I'm Ellie with Whatculture here with 10 most disturbing backstories behind Quentin Tarantino's movie side characters. Number 10. Big John Brittle. When Tarantino laid out the premise for Django Unchained, the prospect of seeing a freed slave dole out some Western-style justice had serious entertainment potential. There was also a decent chance we were going to be exposed to some pretty harrowing scenes, given the subject matter though. As expected, Django received the same old criticism usually leveled at this director. The violence was gratuitous, the language was obscene, and the handling of the subject matter was insensitive. We saw Leonardo DiCaprio and Samuel L. Jackson portray the most reprehensible characters of their careers, but it went with the territory. Set a story in the Deep South during the height of the slave trade and you're going to run into some questionable individuals. Big John Brittle was no exception. A sadistic slave driver who took pleasure in whipping his charges, he stood out for exhibiting a religious fever, hinting at a much darker backstory. One quote he's heard muttering, "And the Lord said to fear ye, and the dread of ye shall be on the beasts of the earth," is taken from the story of Noah when God gave him dominion over the animals of the world. This alluded to the wider practice used by slavers who manipulated religious scripture to exert their dominion over the slaves they deemed like animals. Number 9. Sex Machine. From Dusk Till Dawn is one of Tarantino's wilder scripts. The majority of the film plays out like your standard Tarantino crime flick. Then, out of nowhere, the movie turns into a grisly horror fest. With flesh-eating vampires and George A. Romero-style gore, director Robert Rodriguez played further homage to the genre by casting famed makeup and special effects artist Tom Savini as Sex Machine. True to Tarantino's style, the character was distinctively eccentric, carrying a whip and brandishing a double-six shooter from his crotch, which he aptly used to blast the undead to pieces. Given his fondness for scantily clad women and his not-so-subtle nickname, one can only assume this guy had a pretty big appetite when it came to coitus. However, more about the character's background was revealed in the TV adaptation. Sex Machine, real name Aidan Tanner, was revealed to have lost his penis in a horrible smelting accident as a child. Turns out all the metal gun posturing really was just a way to compensate for something, or a lack of something. Number 8. Mr. Blue. Mr. Blue had a brief but memorable appearance as a criminal in Reservoir Dogs. Apart from exchanging a few lines about the moral obligation to tip, we don't see him do much though. Indeed, his character has an off-screen death. Although we don't know much about the character, Tarantino hired actor Edward Bunker, who brought his own backstory to the role. Born in 1933, Bunker had an extensive and troubled history as a criminal before turning to writing and acting in his later years. Before the age of 18, he'd been in and out of juvenile correctional facilities, admitted to a mental hospital, and spent time in San Quentin State Prison. Much of his adult life was spent incarcerated or in the criminal underworld, orchestrating bank robberies and running a lucrative drug smuggling business during the 70s. His published books detailed the harsh realities of a life of crime, including being abused by prison staff and stabbing a fellow inmate during a disagreement. This guy was the real deal. Number 7. Sergeant Hugo Stiglitz. Hugo Stiglitz was a man of few words, but his actions spoke loudly. Perhaps the decision to write a German member of the Bastards was influenced by the need to paint some Germans in a more favourable light, but regardless of origin, Hugo Stiglitz was a total badass. He was famed for killing up to 13 Gestapo officers in brutal ways. By the time we meet him, he's already well entrenched with the Bastards, and his kill count is likely a lot higher. Tarantino gave him just enough of a backstory to make his hatred of the Nazis feel personal. As an enlisted man, he served as a sergeant, but before long went on a wild rampage, strangling German officers with piano wire or suffocating them with his fists. Presumably, his actions were motivated out of a general disdain for fascism. As the plot develops, however, we find out Hugo has a particular hatred for members of the SS. The sight of Major Hellstrom in the underground bar scene triggered his memory of being whipped and tortured before the Bastards managed to free him. Number 6. Big Fred. Gratuitous violence goes hand in hand with a Tarantino movie, but even the torture scene in Reservoir Dogs seemed tame compared to what we saw in Django Unchained. The graphic depictions of violence were made more disturbing given the context in which they were happening. The sadistic plantation owner Calvin J. Candy is first introduced reveling over a brutal Mandingo fight. The depiction of two slaves viciously grappling with one another while a bunch of wealthy white folks sat on watch was harrowing stuff. After a vicious struggle, Big Fred, Candy's prize fighter, gains the upper hand by blinding his opponent before finishing him off with a hammer. Even for Tarantino, this was a tough scene to sit through. What makes this more uncomfortable is the background profile of the supposed natural warrior Big Fred. Tarantino wanted to stress to actor Escalante Lundy that his character was unlike typical fighters. In his younger days, he was a gentle giant with little instinct for violence and a caring nature. His size and strength drew attention, however, and before long he found himself being selected for the ring. Through harsh conditioning and faced with life or death, Fred was forced to battle his own nature, becoming a brutal and effective killer. Number 5. Richie Gecko. From Dusk Till Dawn is not part of Tarantino's official 10 movies, but he did write it. The Robert Rodriguez-directed picture features Tarantino playing a crazed and unhinged criminal, with a knack for violent outbursts and a less-than-savory fixation with women's feet. Throughout the movie, it's established that Richie is a murderer. One of the first things he does is shoot somebody in cold blood, but the movie heavily implies he's also a serial rapist. His brother, played by George Clooney, seems to be constantly battling with this fact. He clearly wants to protect his brother, but also finds his actions abhorrent. Not much is known about the background to these guys, other than the fact that they're career criminals and mass murderers. But the character was expanded in the TV series adaptation. It's revealed that the reason for Richie's unhinged and psychotic character is due to his childhood. Raised by an abusive father, Richie snapped and set fire to his father's house while he was drunk, burning him alive. Number 4. Rufus. Samuel L. Jackson has had a major role in most Tarantino movies, and even when he's not featured prominently, he often gets a small cameo. In Inglourious Basterds, his voice can be heard giving the backstory on Hugo Stiglitz, and in Kill Bill Volume 2, he featured briefly as Rufus, the piano player at the bride's wedding. Rufus is a fairly mysterious character. He states that he was previously a drifter and part of a gang, but little more is known about him. This has led to the theory that Rufus is actually Jules from Pulp Fiction, after his character decides to walk the earth and become a drifter. Tarantino has stated that many of his characters cross over in movies and leaves links and clues connecting them, so this is possible. But given that he also stated Kill Bill exists as a movie in the Pulp Fiction universe, there's another possibility. After Jules gave up his life of crime, he became an actor and is in fact playing the role of Rufus. Whichever is true, Rufus's past is riddled with skeletons. Blowing your friend's head off in the backseat of your car is bound to disturb you. Number 3. Captain Koons. Christopher Walken's appearance in Pulp Fiction might have only lasted 4 minutes, but his monologue will forever be remembered. His brief performance as Captain Koons, a Vietnam veteran with a mission to traumatize, played an important role in the story of Bruce Willis's character Butch. While Butch is preparing to leave town, he realizes he's forgotten something he can't do without: his father's war watch, a prized family heirloom. It's during a flashback that the audience discovers the reason why Butch holds the watch so dearly. Captain Koons relays how he and Butch's father were prisoners of war during Vietnam. By all accounts, it was a traumatic experience. Not only did Butch's father die of dysentery, but he also spent 5 years concealing the watch in his ass. Koons revealed he was also forced to stow the hunk of metal where the sun don't shine for an additional 2 years. Tarantino wrote the character, inspired by the hundreds of American vets who were held by the Viet Cong. The longest to be imprisoned was Floyd James Thompson. He spent 9 years in various camps, in which time he was beaten, starved, and hung by his thumbs, spending up to 5 years in complete isolation. Number 2. O-Ren Ishii. As mentioned, whereas some films take place in the real Tarantino universe, others take place in his movie universe. For example, Kill Bill exists as a movie that characters in Pulp Fiction will go and see. This is why some Tarantino movies feel a little more grounded and others get away with being a little more wacky. This gave Tarantino a chance to go wild with Kill Bill, with unrealistic action sequences and characters with superhero-like combat skills. One of the most formidable and impressive was O-Ren Ishii, played by Lucy Liu. Ishii was a member of the Deadly Viper assassination squad. She also became a prominent figure in Tokyo's criminal underworld by the age of 25. Impressive stuff, but her motivation was born out of her dark past. As a child, Ishii witnessed her mother and father brutally murdered by a Yakuza crime boss named Matsumoto. The experience left her scared. When Ishii was 11, she finally got her revenge, taking advantage of Matsumoto's perversion for children, seducing him and killing him. Number 1. The Gimp. The Gimp only featured shortly in Pulp Fiction, but will forever be etched in audiences' minds for the troubling scene in which he appeared. This scene is up there with the greatest and most disturbing moments in cinema history. Without going into too much detail, Ving Rhames gets sexually assaulted and Bruce Willis kills a rapist with a samurai sword. All to the sounds of vintage surf rock. It's very Tarantino. At one point, the audience is introduced to a latex-clad Gimp who sleeps in a cage. The character seems compliant with his captors and even tries to warn his abusers when Butch attempts to escape. The last we see of the masked character, he's hanging by his shackles, unconscious or dead, but who was he? After years of fans speculating how this guy came to be sleeping in a box dressed in bondage gear, Tarantino finally revealed something about his backstory. Turns out he was a hitchhiker who'd been kidnapped and held in the dingy basement for 7 years. Grim.